You're listening to the Quint's podcast.
Welcome to season 2 of the Quint Fortnightly podcast, Land of a Billion. We aim to bring you expert conversations about the most contentious of the holy roti kapda makan trinity, that is, the makan over our heads and the larger ecosystem that governs it. This podcast is produced in association with the Property Rights Research Consortium, supported by Umidiyar Network India. I'm Bhargavi, a researcher interested in land and access to finance, and your host for this season. When it comes to land ownership and access, developing and developed countries do many things differently, right from preserving land records to building institutions, enforcing property rights, very many differences across countries. However, if there is one common feature on property ownership and access that binds all countries, like Tolkien would put it as ring that rules them all, it is the gender gap in access and ownership of land. While there is wide variation across countries in this gender gap, men are more likely to own property than women almost everywhere. For example, in India, an NCAER survey shows that while women constitute 42% of the agricultural labor force, they own less than 2% of its farmland. Why does this happen? How is it so consistent across geographies? Has it changed over time? And how does this gender gap affect women's socio-economic status and their quality of life? To break down the social phenomena underlying this consistent trend, we speak to two guests here today. We have with us Shipra Dev, who leads Land ESA's work for gender equal and inclusive land governance in India. Shipra specializes in designing and implementing gender responsive strategies and development programs, including those related to land. Her work in the past 2 decades has focused on expanding opportunities for rural women and girls, enabling them to have more control over their lives. We also have with us Pranab Chaudhary, who's a researcher and consultant on natural resource management and governance with more than 25 years of experience. Pranab has founded the Center for Land Governance in 2015, which is known for its policy and action oriented research on inclusive land tenure. I know the Center for Land Governance as the home of the India Land and Development Conference, a fantastic platform that actually aggregates great research all over the country on issues of land policy. Welcome, Shipra and Pranab, to the Land of a Billion podcast.
Thank you, Bhargavi. Thank you for having us today.
Thanks, Bhargavi.
Sure. So, let's begin with perceptions. So, Shipra, in one of your papers, I remember you had described a fantastic experience where you asked a group of agronomists to draw a farmer, and most of them drew male figures. And this is also true for a lot of us. When we picture a farmer, more often than not, we are thinking of a man. This is despite the 2011 census suggesting that actually 4 out of 5 women in rural India work in agriculture. Could you tell us what has shaped this perception of, men always being equal to farmers? Are there socio-legal factors that have contributed to our perception? What is this identity deprivation that is going on here?
I will begin with the pre colonial periods when the land was controlled by communities themselves, and everyone in the community, both men and women, had collective rights over the produce of land. So, in those times, everyone's interests were taken care of, and women were co sharers in every field. So, probably there was absolutely no need to talk of women's independent rights in those settings. What happened was that during the colonial times, the Britishers were more interested in collecting revenue, and land, especially agricultural land, was the major source of revenue to them. So they introduced the idea of individual ownership of land. And in this new dispensation, it were only men who were given proprietary titles to land. So women, therefore, were automatically excluded from their customary shares and they became increasingly dependent on men. Several scholars have observed that this shift from community ownership and shared access of natural resources to increasing fragmentation and privatization led to women being increasingly divorced from access and control over land and resources. Secondly, what happened was that it was again during the colonial times when the codification of laws began. So when laws were codified in India, including inheritance laws and other revenue laws, it wasn't just the India's customary practices and legal doctrines that were getting codified, but in fact there were rules that were borrowed from British or other laws. So even British women in those time hadn't had the laws that spoke of their rights to property. So it was highly unlikely for British authorities to concede to women's equal rights to land. Thirdly, what happens is we as a society presume that land belongs to the household and that household heads are men and that everyone's interests in the household are congruent. This actually causes women's independent identity to be subsumed in the identity of the household, which is considered to be male headed. And at the time of independence, also, when the land reforms were introduced in India, the popular principle was land to the tiller, and the tiller was almost always considered a man. So, as a result, what happens is all these presumptions together are reflected in the policies of colonial times, and they have been carried forward into the land reforms which were enacted post independence in India. As a result, most of the modern day policies and laws which govern land today, and these includes policies related to land distribution by the government, fixation of ceiling, forfeiture of surplus land, fragmentation of agricultural holdings, and most importantly, inheritance laws. They have all remained largely conservative with respect to rights of women, and together, this gamut of laws have really ensured that the existing patriarchal hold over land continues generation after generation, and women's marginalization in land ownership remains as such. So that's what is the social and legal factors which come into play.
Thanks, Shipra. I think it's a very good point to begin with, right? Which is that was land ownership always like this? I mean, was it always so skewed in favor of men, or have things changed? And one thing that strikes me about the narrative that you mentioned about how codification of laws and really actually recording land rights led to this skewed ownership structure. Couple of things. One is, when we say that actually India started codifying laws once the we had enough tangible of an idea that we are going to get independence soon, we actually departed from several practices that were prevalent in India before the codification process started, right? So, for example, our constitution looks remarkably different. We took into account many social realities, and I wonder why we did not take into account the social reality of community ownership that existed prior to codification. So, that strikes me as important as how we've actually been maybe there was some selective recognition of social realities at that time. Maybe there was nobody who was standing up for this cause at that time, and we just ended up continuing with the same sort of practices of land record ownership that the British followed. And that contrast strikes me as interesting, that while some social realities were recognized in codification, others weren't. And Pranab, you know this, right? Which is that the lack of reliable data on land ownership among women. And there is a lot of work that has been done on this front, but you have explained previously that how different data shows this proportion of land ownership by women very differently. Could you tell us how have these different data sets come together, and does it reflect one true picture, or do we see different pictures depending on which scholarship you're reading at any given point of time?
Thanks, Bhargavi. I think this is a very important question. While the documentation codification definitely widen that gap and make it clearly visible during colonial and post-colonial regimes, the thinking around that was already there, and in a way around that the whole system of dowry, marriage. So always something how you control the property, how you control the women, the power and patriarchy was trying to sustain that. I think that same reflection to in a very rather unconscious way or subconscious way is reflected in the land right data. I think these data sets have just added a gender dimension to segregate, but they have never looked at seriously this whole land tenure dynamics, looking at how important it is for women to own land. So what has happened, what has been there, that has been recorded. And if you look at the different data sets, so they also, the way they define based on, this women land ownership, particularly based on their own, understanding. Because we talk about land ownership, but if you look at the data sets, they hardly record land ownership. And even if you look at land ownership, for example, we are talking about the Digital India Land Rights Protection Program research that NCR made, that also records something which is recorded in the title. And as all of you know, the ownership and the way India's titling as well are different. What is there actually? There is a land people relationship. So, as all of you know, it is a continuum. So, somewhere you have a right or a bundle of right, we call it. You have right to own and alienate. You have right to use. You have right to manage. You have right to access. So, if you look at these different data sets which record land in the name of men or women, they also measure this differently. And as a result of which, as you were talking about the DLRP data that NCR looked at, women farmers right as 2%. So it varies widely from 2% to 60%. Like Prindex talks about 60%. Somewhere this National Family Health Census talks about family survey. NFHS, the recent report is out talking about around 35 to 40%. ISDS sometimes talk about 11%. Agriculture census talks about 14%. Socioeconomic caste census put a different figure. And this ICRISAT survey that Dina Agrawal has been quoting also put a different figure. And interestingly, if you look at the metadata, the way they present, they're very different. For example, if you look at India Human Development Survey, they measure at an individual level, not at a household level. And they see that in every household, which are the three individuals owning the land, and out of them, how many are women. So in that context, they put it as 11%. So it is a completely like what percentage of women are there in the three members list that own land, top three members list that own land in a family. So this is completely different. If you look at agriculture census, it look at something called operational holding. Operational holding is not exactly the ownership. This is something which is a kind of ownership plus tenant relationship. Suppose if you own some land 5 acres and you are leasing in 2 acres, so it becomes 7 acres, and you lease out 3 acres. So 4 acres is your operational holding, but 5 acres is the land ownership, the land you own. And interestingly, in India, the operational land holding are as per the ownership of the head of the household, and the gender is again as per the head of the household. If the head of the household is a woman, then it will be treated as it belongs to them. It is not a woman, it will not treated as them. So in that case, only where the head of the household is women, there the operational holding is treated as belongs to women land, right? And that put the figure as about 14%. So similarly, the different figures are there. But interestingly, what is happening over the year that we have been observing and analyzing data with every census, we find one interesting thing, that it is increasing every census or every survey. Though it is very slow, but it is increasing. We also see a very interesting pattern from north to south. We see most of the states in south, they have comparatively higher women land ownership than north. So just looking at women land right, I'd say while data are complex, between the data and between the geography and between other variables, we see a lot of interesting trends, which also explains why in some states or some districts are having better land ownership. And overall, we also see that that trend is increasing. So just to summarize, while we always say there is lack of reliable data in India, but I think India is a country where data is really diversified, rich, and different sources are there. And that sources, if you go deeper into that, provide an interesting landscape to to research and analyze and understand what is human land right. But at the same time, overall, it gives a very confusing space. And if you look at the standard data that we look to report SDG, this 14% is too small. So that there is a long, I think, low road to achieve.
Got it. So, Pranav, what I'm hearing you saying is that depending on what is being measured, the results will be different, right? And I think that makes intuitive sense, which is that if you're measuring operational holding, or if you're measuring by ownership, or if you're measuring just in terms of the just the right to use land, maybe the results will be different. If you're measuring the number of women as a percentage of the household, the results will be different. And depending on what you're measuring, the results will be different. But what I'm hearing you saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that one consistent trend that emerges is that with every census, it does seem like women are gaining more access to land. This trend is slow, but it is happening, and that's probably a good sign. Maybe it varies across state. The speed is different across states, and there are different reasons for that. And that actually gives us the perfect natural experiment, right? So for example, if we see that some regions are actually making slower progress than others, then what is going on in those regions that is slowing down the progress is something that we can see. And we'll come to the policy interventions that actually expedite or slow down progress when it comes to women's access to land and land ownership. But before that, I wanted to ask Shipra actually that we began this conversation with, the perception of women as farmers or the non perception of women as farmers. Do you think it makes a difference to the reality of women when they're deprived of their identity as farmers, and how?
Yeah, absolutely, Bhargavi. When women are not recognized as farmers, they get actually ignored in the entire agriculture ecosystem, and their contribution to agriculture becomes just an extension of their unpaid household work. Now, if you look at the textbooks of pre-primary school, and we are teaching the pre-primary students people who help us, and when we are making the picture of a farmer, it's almost always a man. And it's true for other workforce as well. When we picture a driver, a doctor, a soldier, all of them are invariably men.
Yeah, sorry, Shipra, sorry, I'm really tempted. I can't resist this one. The only women farmer that comes to mind, when you say this, is the poster of Mother India. And that too, if you remember that poster, it is that of the the main actor in that movie. I don't know her name, too young for
Mother
that, but
India, Nargis.
right, where they show her dragging a plow and
Yeah,
in the
yeah.
in the field, and that's such a sad picture. But it seems to me that actually that at least in popular culture as well, it seems to be the perception that Jai Jawan Jai Kisan is always somehow linked to men. And I can literally just think of one film poster that actually shows a woman as a farmer.
And what happens is, when we see a farmer as a man portrayed everywhere, including, the advertisements that we see for agricultural inputs, say for fertilizer, and advertisements that we see from banking institutions, which are to extend credit to farmers, we will always see men and men pictured here. When we see, hoardings for agricultural fairs, it's all men. So what happens is, when we grow up and when we are conditioned to see men as only farmers, it's the same people with the same conditioning who one day become policy makers. And when we design policies with these mindsets, we tend to target policies only for men. Then women are not included in agricultural trainings and extension services. When extension people, they go to the villages to organize meetings with farmers, they just conduct meetings with men, and they tell their technologies and products to men, and women are just left out. Similarly, agricultural research is also not targeted to women's needs and is not attuned to their perspectives and knowledge. What happens is, when women do not own land, they also are not able to benefit from various agriculture support programs such as credits, subsidies, crop insurance, and marketing facilities. All of these continue to be linked to land ownership. If you go to a wholesale mandi today in any city, you will see that it's just male's space. It's just a men's domain. It's very difficult for a rural woman who is producing agricultural products to come to that mandi and negotiate price with a male aarti, and then being able to sell. I have myself visited these mandis, and I've seen how difficult it is for women to just participate in those mandi processes. So if, for example, there is a policy that helps women farmers sell their produce within in mandi in transparent ways, these things will be helpful. But just because our policymakers tend to see only men as farmers, all these needs of women farmers continue to get ignored. Now, While women do not receive the identity and the dignity and the opportunities they deserve, it's also important to see that because of all these blocks, they are very often unable to contribute fully to the economy. And this results in high costs, both in terms of economic development as well as human development for the nation. There is this very often cited data by FAO that if women farmers had equal access to resources, credit, farming equipment, and new technologies, yields could increase by 20 to 30% per household, and countries could experience an increase in agricultural output by, I think, 2.5 to 4%. But Bhargavi, beyond these numbers and these intricate connections, I find that land rights for women are critically important because they change the way women are viewed in the society and also the way women view themselves. These land rights, they really dig down to the root of gender inequality, radically and quietly uprooting it, overturning it. And just because land is such a powerful asset, with its ownership, women get the power to get control of their own lives to a great extent. And that's why I think it's really important to work on this one thing if we aim for gender equality one day.
I honestly think that, actually women, I mean, we associate professions with different genders, right? So, for example, I agree that I do not think of a woman when you mention the word farmer, but then I can think of when you mention the word teacher, for example, or when you mention other informal work such as women carrying water where there is no tap water, women walking for kilometers and carrying water. We don't really imagine men being in that position. We imagine women. Many people call it romanticizing the idea that women are able to carry, multiple pots of balance, multiple pots of water on their head, etc. But it seems to me that actually we associate genders with different professions, associating the male gender irrespective of the reality with farming actually has real consequences and deprives women of the many benefits that the state provides, for example, or even capacity building when it comes to training, because the atmosphere is never designed, or the trainings are never designed to especially include women. So I wonder, is this a special case of India, or do we see that this is different elsewhere? What does Pranab think about this? Do you find that the practices, that the perception is India specific, emerging market specific, or do you see other countries designing things specially for women farmers?
Yeah, Bhargavi, this is quite interesting again because if you look at a farmer, you see a face of a man or think of a man image coming in. But if you look at an agricultural laborer, if you look at paddy transplanting, if you look at weeding, which are the more painstaking processes, always women photographs comes to your mind or a picture comes to your mind. I think many of you who would be hearing it must be watching this famous Spanish Netflix serial Money Heist. And the Money Heist, there is a song, the title song. This title song, though it is being now celebrated as a Renaissance song, as a song of freedom, there is a title song which is celebrated in Italy and now it is going around the world thanks to Money Heist. Also, earlier many social movement they patronized that song as a song of liberation. But if you go to the history of that history of that song is linked to the Italy's paddy cultivating women, the agricultural laborers who would be doing transplanting and weeding in paddy fields, and they would sing this song to support each other and dream of getting liberated one day. So that is something ironical. Even in the farmer, there is a farming hierarchy. There is a landowning farmer, there is a tenant farmer, there is an agricultural laborer. So tenant farmers are always poor, small farmers, those we call peasants or peasantry around which the revolution. So that image is also there in the literature, the people studying that. And also when you talk about agricultural labor, you think about women. So this is something which is not only characteristic of India. If you go to neighboring countries, I have been working in very closely in other South Asian countries, Nepal, Bangladesh, and there I see. I think Pakistan is a little different, but if you look at Nepal and Bangladesh, most of the farmers are women. If you look at farming, the more agroecological, the more organic, the more diversified, the more sustainable farming is, more women are associated with that. The more mechanized, more commercial, more tractors, more input the farming is, it is more men doing that. So in a way, if you look at the sustainability, climate change resilience, if women are farmers, so I'll just extend Sipraj's argument that is not only 20-30% extra yield, but a better farming is always performed by women. Because we talk about something called land husbandry, but this husbandry is more done by women than men. So this is something which also we must need to recognize. Again, no, just to connect what Shipra was telling. See, if you look at the way government support farmers, so nowadays you must be knowing government is supporting farmers through something called DBT, direct benefit transfer, where farmers are registered in the state farming portals. Every state have agriculture farmer portals, and where farmers have to register themselves, and all the subsidies, all the grants, all the benefits would go to them through a direct benefit transfer process. And unfortunately, in all these registrations, you have to submit land records, as a result of which most of the money, even if it is feminized farming like in Uttarakhand or in some other states, women are doing the farming, money goes to the male. So this is in a way put women at a completely disadvantaged position vis-a-vis men as a farmer. So even if you are putting same labor, same effort, because you will have limited access to support services and credit, you end up becoming a loser. So women farmers are also completely in a way neglected and putting it a very competitive disadvantaged position. Globally, we see the access to agricultural land, control over agricultural land is more decided by religious and cultural practices, and to a great extent, they have been perpetuated when the law and formalization also coming in.
Much of the debate around land record management is about formalization, and or rather the lack of it, right? And what you are suggesting is that actually formalization may end up entrenching existing inequalities, even perpetuating them more. What are some of the policy measures that you think might actually help women get their fair share of land? What do you think can states or governments or even local level administrations can do to make sure that they get their fair share of access?
Just to extend the point, no, Argav, you are making land record, making the adding the name in land record. So something, no, all of us we know that one of the measures that is being shown as a big success and as best practices or good practices is joint titling. It started with 1980s, where Planning Commission suggested that, and where every state went ahead with joint titling, be it new government land, that is to be allocated as grant, or proposing farmers to buy the land also to add women name. So what has happened here, if you see, we analyze the case of joint titling in Orissa, we found most of the joint titling, around 95% were around homestead land. But when we do agriculture land, joint titling is too less. So this is something we have to see how, if you are really trying to get policies change. And then again, another thing is happening when you look at the stamp duty reduction. Many states have taken stamp duty reduction in the favor of women, or completely waiving the stamp duty, because in India the stamp duty is very high. I think we have also written a lot about that, 7 to 8%. So people tend to avoid stamp duty by registering land in the women's name. But it is mostly happening in some urban areas. So whatever policy change is taking place, they are trickling down to women in certain ecosystems, in certain land uses, in certain geographies, not across. So what could be done? I think one thing, to recognize the fact that farming is a profession, and farming is not only linked to land ownership but to a land tenure continuum. For example, where you get a crop loan, see all the farming entitlement, crop loan, insurance, fertilizer subsidy, market linkages, everything is linked to crop, not to land. So the crop could be seasonal, could be annual, could be a couple of years. Most of the cases it is less than a year. And when agriculture labor or tenant is farming in that land, if you can recognize as a them as a farmer, irrespective of that land ownership, and extend them these advantages of credit, this insurance and everything. So then what happens? This farmer becomes more competitive, and gradually they start earning more. Once they start earning more, once they start become successful, they acquire dignity in the in the society. They also, their income also increases, and they would be able to buy a land later. So one of the clear low hanging fruit is that identify farming as a profession, not dealing it from land ownership, and link all the entitlements of the farmer to the farming profession. So when a woman is farming, let the women, irrespective of the land ownership, whether the land is there in our name or not, you extend the benefits to them. That is number one. I think model land leasing act that government of India has brought in can in a big way in help that. Second is that extend joint titling to agricultural land. No, many states have been trying to do that, like Lakshmi Mukti Abhijan to a great extent in Maharashtra, but again, got limited to mostly housing thing. So, how we can extend this joint titling to agricultural land? Just adding the women name in the land record is not enough, because that also doesn't make them fight against the power and patriarchy and take control. So access is not equal to control. But I would say access is an entry point to control. So if you can have little access in the name of no joint titling, adding name in land record, like joint titling will be now more pervasive, because if you look at even India's Forest Right Act, it talks about joint titling. And about 40 million hectares of agriculture, forest land is going to be under Forest Right Act. So that way, most of the tribal women and Dalit and other women living close to forest will be able to access that. Similarly, we can extend joint titling to other agricultural land. So I think these two things, if you can really want to help women farmer, identifying farming as a profession, delinking it to from land ownership, and based on the land tenure, like the use and management or leasing land position, extending them all legal rights, and then expanding the joint titling will be the two easy entry points to make women farmers more competitive and better recognized and having their dignity.
Got it. Shipra, do you want to come in here on policy interventions that you think could help this?
As Pranav mentioned so emphatically about joint titling, it really takes me to the earlier point which I was making about the mindsets of policymakers. And whenever we talk about joint titling, it really takes me also to the example that I see in Uttar Pradesh. The state of Uttar Pradesh has this policy of joint titling, just like several other states have. But if you go to the policy guidelines, I mean, the language of the law in which these joint titlings are issued. The language of the law says that if a land is allocated to a man, and if the man is married, then the name of the wife will also be added to that land allocation. Now, when I was talking about the mindset of the policymakers, this language is just the exact depiction of that. It really tells us how people, even when they are giving joint titling as a policy, they are making a policy on joint titling, they are considering a male to be the primary receiver and a woman just as the appendage to that. So I was just making that point here. But other than this, I think even when states have policies related to joint titling and expansion in land leasing provisions, what is more important is recruitment and training of women personals in the revenue departments. One is that even the existing revenue officials, they need to be trained on the provisions which are there specifically for women, and also on the specific issues related to gender. And then it is important that the revenue officials working in field comprise of some women officials as well, so that the domain itself becomes some sort of gender inclusive. Then I really think it is important to impart land literacy and awareness to rural women massively, so that they know about their existing rights and can assert them as they deem fit. Secondly, I think it's also important for the states to prioritize landless women in the public land distribution efforts, whatever they do. It's important to enumerate and identify landless women, especially from the vulnerable categories such as SC and ST sections, and then prioritize land distribution to them. And I think it is also important for states to have a gender disaggregated database at all levels. And then finally, I had been saying that gender audit of laws is very important, because in a lot of land laws there are a lot of biases related to women which need to be addressed. And this the language of joint title is just one that I said. What happens is, when people working in the revenue department read these laws, they just get their ideas of a male being the main landholder, that idea just gets more firmed up in their minds, and that's what gets reflected when they do their work in field. So I think a group of all these things is really important: recruitment of women in revenue workforce, training of existing revenue officials on gender related aspects, land literacy of rural women, and then prioritizing landless women in land distribution systems. I think all of these are really important.
Got it. So that's a long wish list. But, I always ask the guests that, in the spirit of the name of our podcast, which is Land of a Billion, if you had to pick one core challenge that India needs to focus on, and I'm allowing you only one because that's the hard part, right? Which one will you prioritize? Which one will you put your heft behind to secure land rights for a billion? What would that be? Pranav, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I think that this is a very difficult question. See, one is that I think we need to engage. We need to keep, engaging, keep raising this question again and again, and trying to, pushing the needle forward. So this thing, I think that is the only. If you put one thing, I think that engagement is there. But in that context, I see one thing which can really make a billion number possible is technology. Technology has its own limitation. Technology is always also has a divide. But I see particularly adding women name into the Digital India Land Records programs, into the India's Forest Right Act IFR records, and also to add women name, particularly the daughter's name, into the land record as per Hindu Succession Act. These three things can be possible by using technology, which is now possible with kind of work we are doing around Aadhaar, to kind of work we are doing around health care, cards. So there are ways and means to link the records and make it more automated. And with India's digitization progress, I think we can definitely add a billion women's name, no, not a billion, half a billion women's name into land record, yeah, using technology. But as Sipra said, this is the entry point. It is just enhancing name, adding name, then it will lead to enhanced access, then it will lead to enhanced control. Still a long way to go, but definitely it can be entry point.
Got it. Shipra, one core challenge. I know you have a long wish list, but if you had to put, if you had limited resources, as we always all do, what would you put those resources in?
So I think, one of the first things which I would like to do in land is simplify land laws. There really is a huge maze which anyone, a person like me, when we want to work on land, it becomes really difficult to figure out what applies and what doesn't, because every state has a different way of dealing with land matters. So what I would really, think of one thing is, simplify these land laws so that people are not lost into this huge web, and have a clear sort of path.
Got it. Great. So this is a fantastic conversation. Thanks, Shipra and Pranav, for being on the Land of a Billion podcast. I hope you enjoyed the conversation as well, and I hope our listeners enjoy this too.
Thank you, Vargabi.
Thanks so much, Bhargavi, for hosting this conversation today.
Thanks for tuning in to our podcast, Land of a Billion, produced in association with the Property Rights Research Consortium. Don't forget to catch new episodes every alternate Friday, where I will bring you a rundown on the latest charcha around land and housing in India.
Thanks for listening. Log on to the Quint website and check out our other podcasts.